I was seated at the end of the conference table. MY's shoulders settled back against the chair when MY uncle said it like it was already decided. My hands were flat on the wood. Still, the room was full. Family, 2 outside accountants. An advisor with a legal pad that hadn't been touched yet. This was supposed to be a formal discussion about cash flow and options. Water glasses SAT in front of us like props. No one drank. He didn't look at me when he spoke. He looked around the table, claiming the room. SHE doesn't get a vote, he said, clear and even. SHE was taken in. SHE's not part of the line. A chair SHIFTED. Someone exhaled through their nose. My cousin smiled like this was entertainment. MY uncle kept going, confidence settling in. This is a family business, blood matters, we've been generous long enough. One of the accountants kept his eyes on his paper. His pen moved, slow and careful, like he didn't want his handwriting associated with the moment. I noticed the edge of a manila envelope near the center of the table, its flap slightly bent, as if it had been opened and closed too many times. No one asked me to respond. When he finished, the room went quiet. Not awkward quiet, decided quiet. I let it stay that way. My name is Eliana Marrow. I was 35 at the time, and I'd built my life well away from that room. I lived in Boston in a place I paid for myself, with a job that expected results and paid on time. I worked in financial operations, mostly in structuring and oversight. The kind of role that sits between numbers and consequences. I was brought in when things needed to be made clean or at least defensible. IT wasn't a family trait. It was a skill set I'd developed on purpose. I'd been adopted into the family when I was 8. That fact was never hidden, just handled selectively. It came up when someone wanted to signal generosity. It disappeared when authority was being discussed. The boardroom we were in that day wasn't new to me. I'd SAT that table before, walking people through projections they didn't like. I'd been asked to review agreements informally. I'd been trusted with problems that required discretion. I was there because I'd been invited, not as an owner, not as family. As someone who understood the situation clearly enough to stay calm, I sat where they placed me. I listened. I noted who spoke and who didn't. They still believed they were defining my position. I let them believe that. I had never asked for ownership. What I expected was consistency. For years, I handled what needed to be handled. When a supplier pushed back, I took the call. When a bank requested updated projections, I built them. When a deadline was missed, I stepped in quietly and fixed it before it became a problem anyone else had to explain. Those were not favors. They were responsibilities that were handed to me and accepted without qualification. When people rely on you, there is an understanding that follows, even if it is never spoken. What happened in that room wasn't personal. It was contractual in nature, even if no one used that word. TERMs were redefined after the work was done. Contribution was separated from standing. Responsibility was detached from authority. They made it clear that no amount of performance would ever change my position. Not because of results, because of origin. That clarity mattered. This wasn't a sudden shift. IT fit a pattern I'd seen before. Trust was extended in private and withdrawn in public. Praise was quiet. Exclusion was formal. It had always been ordered that way. I didn't interrupt my uncle because there was nothing left to negotiate. The frame had been set. Fairness is not a sentiment, it is a structure. And when a structure fails, IT doesn't need argument. It needs to be corrected. After that meeting, nothing changed on paper. It never does at first. I was still included when something needed to be fixed. Emails arrived late at night with subject lines that implied urgency. Calls came through without introduction, as if my role required no context. I was asked to review terms before signatures, to flag risks before they became problems, to quietly adjust what others had misread. What never changed was how those contributions were treated in public. My name didn't appear on updated materials. I wasn't introduced to outside partners. When decisions were announced, THEY were presented as if they'd materialized on their own. When credit was distributed, it moved around me. The pattern was consistent enough to track: private reliance, public distance. When things worked, they spoke in generalities. When something broke, THEY called me directly and lowered their voices. At family events, it followed the same shape. Seating arrangements shifted at the last minute. Introductions skipped over JOKES landed just far enough away to avoid response. Nothing overt, nothing accidental. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't ask for a title. I didn't push for a seat. Silence isn't always submission. Sometimes it's positioning. I let them believe the line they'd drawn was fixed. They had no reason to think it would ever be tested. When the business began to show strain, the calls came more frequently. They didn't announce the problems in meetings. They handled them after HOURS. A supplier threatening to freeze shipments. A bank asking for updated projections by morning. A contract that had been signed without anyone reading the exit TERMS. Those moments found their way to me. I took the calls where I was. Sometimes at MY desk. Sometimes in MY kitchen with the lights off and a laptop open. I didn't raise MY voice. I didn't ask why something had been missed. I asked what had already been promised and what was still flexible. I sent back summaries, clean, numbered, options laid out without commentary. They followed my recommendations more often than they admitted, adjusting payment schedules and buying time without acknowledging they'd needed help. No one announced that. Instead, they spoke about we, as if the decisions had come from consensus. As if stability was natural. I didn't correct the language. Credit wasn't the objective. Accuracy was. Every interaction added to a record: who called, when they called, what they asked for, what they agreed to quietly, and what they refused to say out loud. I kept those detailsordred. Competence doesn't require recognition. It requires continuity. And continuity is built over time. By people who know when to speak and when to let systems do the talking. My career had always run parallel to the family business, not through it. That was a choice I made early and never revisited. After college, I moved into financial operations and compliance. The work was methodical, unglamorous, built around rules that only matter when someone decides to ignore them. I learned how agreements actually functioned when people stopped cooperating, where authority lived on paper, how control shifted without anyone having to raise their voice. I earned certifications because they were practical. I sat through audits because they revealed more than meetings ever did. I watched what happened when companies relied too heavily on assumptions and not enough ON structure. None of it was connected to MY family. That distance was important. When I looked at the family business through that lens, I didn't see personality conflicts. I saw intersections between people and systems that had never been stressed. Agreements that worked only as long as everyone behaved. Safeguards that existed but had never been tested. I didn't rush to apply that knowledge. There was no reason to. Structures like that are most effective when they're quiet and left alone. I made notes. I asked questions when it was appropriate. I stored what I learned and moved on with MY life. Positioning isn't about action, it's about readiness, and readiness doesn't announce itself until it's required. The decline didn't arrive with a single failure. It came in measures. The first SIGNS showed up in the requests I was asked to review quietly. Updated projections needed one more pass. Payment schedules were adjusted by a week, then two. Nothing that triggered alarms, but enough to require explanations if anyone looked closely. I looked. By the second quarter, short-term FIXCS were being used to cover long-term GAPS. Extensions stacked on top of each other. Suppliers were paid just late enough to notice. Bank correspondence shifted in tone. Fewer assumptions, more questions. The kind that came with deadlines. One evening, I printed 3 years of financial statements and laid them side by side on MY desk. Same format, same headings, different trajectory. I spent a moment just looking at the dates, how close they were, how quickly confidence had turned into drift. When I flagged issues, I did IT carefully, private calls. Controlled language, this limits flexibility. This reduces options. They agreed in the moment, they nodded, then they continued as before. In meetings, confidence remained. JOKES landed, plans were announced without detail. No one referenced the numbers they'd already seen. I didn't push. Systems rarely fail all at once. They fail quietly first. The important variable was no longer performance. It was timing. And timing had started to move without them. The mechanism that would eventually matter wasn't created in response to the decline. It had existed for years, untouched and mostly ignored. I'd first seen it during a routine review I was asked to help with, framed as housekeeping. The company was still stable then. Revenue was strong enough that no one felt urgency. The assumption was that nothing would ever trigger what was being put in place. I read it the way I read everything. Line by line, slowly. Paying attention to what was automatic and what required discretion. I noted which conditions activated authority and which simply confirmed it. I marked the sections that referenced outside validation, the kind that doesn't care who raised who. The purpose was straightforward: continuity, protection against stagnation. A way to ensure that if decision-makers failed TOACT, the system would step in without asking for permission. It wasn't a punishment tool. It couldn't be. Structures like that only work if they're neutral. I didn't design IT. I didn't need to. I just understood how IT functioned and what conditions would cause it to move forward on its own. At the time, those conditions seemed unlikely. Confidence was high. Authority was unquestioned. Everyone assumed they'd have time to adjust if things ever shifted. Systems don't operate on assumption, they operate on thresholds. And when those are met, they don't ask how anyone feels about IT. They proceed. Once the conditions were close enough to matter, there was no advantage in moving quickly. Processes like that respond to urgency. They respond to sequence. First COMES verification, then review, then confirmation by people who are not invested in anyone's story. They request documents. They wait for responses. They note when those responses arrive late or incomplete or not at all. I answered only what I was asked. Nothing anticipatory, nothing explanatory. Some requests SAT 4 days before I responded, not as a statement. As a calculation, timing created a record all on its own. Each follow-up email, each reminder, each missed window added weight without me having to say a word. I kept a single folder in my home office. No label. Inside it were confirmations, time-stamped correspondence, and a summary page I updated once a week. I would open it, read one page, and close it again. That was sufficient. Questions started coming from the family side too. Indirect ONES. Careful ONES. Are you seeing anything we should be worried about? I let those hang for a beat before answering. When I did, I kept IT narrow, factual, unalarming. Silence is useful if you apply IT correctly. Not as a wall, but as space. Space for other people to keep moving forward without realizing how limited their options had become. When the final confirmations came back clean, there was no sense of arrival, just scheduling. Fair process doesn't announce itself, it continues. The meeting was called with less than a day's notice. That was the first indication that control had started to slip. It was held in the same boardroom, but the energy was different. CHAIRs were pulled closer to the table. Water glasses were half empty before anyone spoke. PHONES SAT face UP this time, screenlit, AS if someone might need an exit. An outside advisor was present. I didn't know HIM, but I recognized the posture. Briefcase placed carefully at his feet. Legal pad aligned with the edge of the table. He spoke to no one until it was necessary. The family filled the silence quickly. They talked about temporary issues, about market pressure, about how certain things had been misunderstood. VOICES overlapped. Sentences were left unfinished. Confidence was still there, but IT was thin, stretched over something unstable. I SAT where I'd been seated before, same chair, same angle. I NOTICED the table had been refinished. The small crack NEAR the edge was still there, filled again, still uneven. When the advisor finally spoke, he did it slowly. He asked for confirmation of receipt on certain notices. He asked who had authority to respond. After each question, he waited. Silence landed heavier than any answer. My uncle looked down the table, expecting support to form out of habit. IT didn't for the first time. I saw them realize this was no longer a family discussion. IT was a procedural one, and procedures don't care who raises their voice. The advisor opened his briefcase and removed a thin stack of papers. He didn't pass them around. He set them in front of HIM, ALIGNED, the EDGES with care and looked up. Before we continue, he said, I need to confirm the status of several conditions. No one answered immediately. My uncle nodded as if that would carry the moment. The advisor waited. He referenced dates first, then amounts, then a series of notices that had been sent and formally acknowledged. His voice was even, unemphatic. Each item was followed by a pause long enough for interruption. None came. One of the accountants asked for clarification on a specific clause. The advisor turned a page and read it word for word. No interpretation, no softening, just text. My cousin interjected. That can't be what it means. The advisor didn't reply to HIM. He looked to the accountant who confirmed authenticity and execution. The confirmation landed without drama. INOTICED, a glass of water being lifted and set back down, untouched. A phone screen dimmed from inactivity. My name was spoken for the first time in that context. I was asked to confirm receipt of a notice. I waited a beat. Yes, I said, I received it. That was enough. The advisor continued, moving to the next page. The room had gone still, the way it does when people realize the order of operations has shifted. What was being read was no longer information. IT was process. And process, once started, doesn't require agreement to continue. Denial didn't come out loud AT first. It slipped in through technicalities. My uncle leaned forward, HANDS flat on the table now. This is being taken out of context, he said. His voice was steady but too careful. These provisions were never meant to be triggered like this. The advisor didn't react. He made a small mark on his legal pad and looked to the accountants. One of them spoke, measured. The language is standard. The conditions are clear. The other nodded. Notice was properly given. My cousin shook his head, a sharp, dismissive motion. Everyone knows what this was supposed to do, he said. You can't ignore intent. The advisor looked up then. Intent is not a variable, he said. Compliance is. That landed differently. A glass SCRAPED against the table. Someone shifted in their chair and didn't settle back. My name came up again, this time with an edge to it. A question that wanted a denial from me. A correction, something to push against what was happening. I didn't provide it. I kept my eyes on the documents in front of the advisor. On the order they were being read. On the fact that no one was skipping ahead. Argument needs participation. ISTAYED still. When denial can't find a counterpoint, it starts to turn inward. VOICES rise, then trail off. Sentences don't finish. The room was quiet again, not decided this time. Uncertain, and uncertainty is where control begins to slip. Panic didn't announce itself. IT leaked. My cousin turned toward my uncle and spoke too quickly, his words stacking over each other. My aunt interrupted HIM, then stopped mid-sentence, as if she'd lost the thread. No one was tracking the room anymore. They were tracking their own distance from what was unfolding. VOICES rose, not to shouting but past control. We can sort this out. This doesn't make sense. There has to be a way to pause it. The advisor let them speak. All of it, he didn't interrupt. When the noise finally ran out of energy, he spoke once. The process is already active, he said. There is no pause mechanism. My uncle turned to me then, really turned. His voice dropped, sharpened by urgency. You knew this could happen. I waited just long enough for the question to settle in the room. I understood the structure, I said. That's all. I kept my tone even, neutral. The words were not a defense. They didn't need to be. He opened his mouth again, then closed it. His eyes moved around the table looking for support. No one met his gaze. The accountants were studying their notes. The advisor was already turning a page. The room had shifted from argument to calculation. From what they could say to what they had left to salvage. Panic isn't loud when it realizes it's too late. It gets precise. Fragmented, quiet. And in that quiet, the outcome became clear without anyone having to say it out loud. The advisor closed the folder in front of HIM and set his hand flat on top of it. The sound was quiet, but it carried. At this stage, he said, there is no provision for withdrawal. No one spoke right away. My aunt started to form a question, then stopped. She looked down at her notes as if the answer might be there if she read long enough. My uncle tried once more. His voice was lower now, measured. Surely there's room for discretion given the history. The advisor shook his head once. Discretion applies before conditions are met, he said. They have been met. One of the accountants confirmed the timeline, dates, signatures, third-party verifications. Each detail was stated without emphasis, each one removing another option. The room shrank with every confirmation. I was asked if I had anything to add. I looked at the table, at the refinished surface, at the small, uneven line where the wood had been filled and sanded too fast. Then I looked up. No, I said. I think it's clear. There was a moment then brief where I registered the satisfaction of finality. ITPASSED. Control returned immediately. My uncle leaned back in his chair, not dramatically, just enough to signal understanding. What he'd lost wasn't money, it was authority. That loss settled differently. The advisor stood and announced that next STEPS would be communicated in writing. No one objected. The process had finished speaking. From here, only time would continue. And time doesn't accept APPALS. The consequences didn't arrive as a single event. They unfolded in SDAGS quietly the way most effective corrections do. Within the first 2 WEKS, formal NOTICES were issued. Council WAS retained. Requests for reconsideration were filed and met with polite, unambiguous responses. Deadlines were MISSED. Technical deficiencies were noted. Each reply closed a door without commentary. By the end of the month, access began to shift. Signing authority WAS reassigned. Bank portals were updated. Internal distribution LISDS were reduced to necessity only. Nothing was announced. People simply stopped appearing where they used to be. The legal challenges followed a familiar pattern. Confidence at the start, then frustration, then a narrowing of options that had always been the limit. Motions were drafted, some were filed, most never advanced. The language was consistent across every response, TERMS enforced, conditions met, no basis for relief. I was not present for any of it. Updates reached me the same way they reached everyone else, through formal summaries and third-party communications. What stood out was not what was said, but what stopped being said. By the end of the quarter, the business was still operating. Employees were paid. Contracts were honored. That mattered. What disappeared was control. Authority moved to where it had always been defined to GO. And once that transfer is complete, IT rarely reverses, not because of malice but because of order. The social consequences arrived more slowly than the legal ONES, but they were cleaner. Invitations changed first. Smaller rooms. Private dinners instead of events. Then those two FADED calendars adjust when people lose influence. No announcement is required. Professional CIRCLES MOVED faster. BIOS were quietly updated. Committee LISDS were revised. A panel appearance was postponed. A consulting role was restructured. The language was neutral, carefully and accusatory. That was the point. When authority SHIFTS etiquette takes over, I heard about most of IT indirectly. A colleague mentioning a change in passing. A notice attached to a newsletter I read on a train ride home. One short item in a trade publication confirming a governance update, written in the kind of tone that makes events feel inevitable. There were attempts to reach me. A few voicemails left too late at night. Emails that started formal and ended vague. I didn't return them, not out of anger, because there was nothing left to discuss. The distance wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. Social SYSDEMS follow authority, and when authority relocates, they realign without comment. By the end of the year, family functions continued without me, and I continued without them. That separation wasn't bitter, it was orderly, and it held. With time, everything settled into proportion. The business continued under new oversight. Quieter, more cautious. I didn't follow the DETALS. Systems that are properly aligned require monitoring. They function without drama, and without me, my own routine never shifted. Same work, same commute, same apartment I'd built without their help. That consistency was the clearest confirmation that nothing had been taken from me that I hadn't already outgrown. Justice, when it's EARNED, doesn't feel like victory. It feels like pressure, lifting, like no longer having to account for a distortion that was never yours to fix. MONTHS later, I saw my uncle by chance, a public space. No context for a scene, we stopped, exchanged a polite nod. His posture was different, not broken, simply unanchored. Authority once removed doesn't leave a placeholder. I held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, then looked away. There was no satisfaction in it, only finality. Boundaries don't require explanation, they require enforcement and then distance. What had been DENIED to ME was status, not capability. Status can be revoked by people. Capability is confirmed by structure and time. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do. The matter was finished. And it remained THATY.